Hey, welcome to Mikey's Video Game Madness. Today we are playing the Japanese version of Castlevania 3 on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, released on PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and the Switch, and I believe the PC. So today we're playing obviously the PlayStation 4 version because that's what I usually play of everything, usually, unless it's an exclusive or I say otherwise. And I don't think I've filmed any Xbox One videos yet, just because my Xbox One X is such an expensive system compared to all the other ones. I'm so worried about unplugging and plugging everything. I need to get over it because it's not really a big deal. I don't have a bunch of Xbox One games, but it's still a concern, and I need to get over it because I don't have that many games, so I should just do it all in one shot at one point. There's only a handful of other games I'm thinking about getting for that system, and that'll be it. Now that I've purchased it, sometimes I'm like, was it really worth it? I don't know. Because even when there's a slightly better version, I still usually get the games for the PlayStation 4, and I'm sure there's something you can get where you can use a PlayStation 4 controller and try to trick yourself, but it's like a preference. I don't know. It's a psychological thing. I can't really justify why, even if I can get a better version, I'd rather play on the PlayStation 4, although the only valid excuse I have is that I have an expanded hard drive already on the PlayStation 4 Pro, and I don't feel like the difference is that large. I kind of wanted the Xbox One for the exclusives, and even though it's not the best player in the world to get the 4K Blu-rays to be able to watch those, which look, depending on which source it is, looks better on that particular system. So I've filmed at least 2 videos of Castlevania 3 when I first started this channel way early on. I did the Japanese version and the American version. This is the Japanese version. I believe the Japanese version that I did in the past was the modded English version, which is an awesome ROM. Just recently, within the last few weeks, Konami actually did something really awesome, which was add some of the Japanese versions of their Castlevania games on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection for free. And since this isn't being exactly the NES version, I figured I might as well share this one. Plus, this is one of my favorite NES games. I think the only NES game that comes close to this is Super Mario Bros. 3. Ironically, this is Castlevania 3, but this would be one of my favorite games until Castlevania Symphony of the Night came out. This was probably my second favorite Castlevania game. Bloodlines was my favorite before Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and then it would have been Castlevania 3, and then Super Castlevania 4, and then the original Castlevania. I'm sure a lot of people think Super Castlevania 4 is a better game, but you'll notice the sprites for the little hunchback guys, I think that's what they're called, and the little instruction manual are different in the Japanese version. They're like these little lizard things, which is really weird because in the Japanese version of the first game, which I'll eventually cover, they're actually the same sprite as the American version. The zombies are also different looking in the Japanese version, but this is full-on Japanese, whereas the one I played before, I think, had the English text for the storyline, which was actually better translated than the American version, and they actually used the American names, although for for the time period, I don't know if Ralph sounded time appropriate. I think Trevor is actually a better name, which is what the American version of Castlevania 3 ended up using. Trevor Ralph was the Japanese versions of this protagonist. I'm glad Netflix chose to use Trevor for their adaptation of this game. The Netflix series is actually adapting this game. They just don't include all of the characters, specifically trying to think of his name. I think it's Grant. Yeah, I believe it's Grant, the guy that could shoot daggers. Also, there's slight differences where Grant could actually throw daggers, where he can just stab in the American version. So this one's a little bit easier than the American version because this came out during the controversy where Nintendo was kind of against game rentals, so they a lot of times purposely made their games more difficult. Another noteworthy thing besides some of the sprite changes is the difficulty. The difficulty, beside Grant being able to use swords, is a little bit different, and in the long run makes the game easier. And the way that works is that every enemy has a set amount of health points that they take away if they attack you and hit you every single time, and it's always that amount of health bars taken away, which is more difficult when you first start out, but it gets easier as you go later on in the game, because in the American version, as you progress further in the game, no matter what enemy it is, even if it was an easier enemy that you fought earlier in the game, they still take significantly more health than they would in the Japanese version. So the Japanese version starts out perhaps maybe a little bit more difficult, but then later on ends up being easier. I use scanlines. I don't know how they're going to show up on YouTube, but for this particular series, I really like the filters, and that's comes down to nostalgia. I played the shit out of this game on the crappiest TV for so long, so seeing everything super pixel perfect and pristine and clear, I don't know why, it's kind of weird to me. I'm used to it being kind of blurry, looking out of focus, and kind of having the scan lines. It isn't perfect, but it does create more of a nostalgic feel to me than playing it super clear. I don't know why. I wish they had like the little color bleed that some of the filters do in some other games and emulators, but it works. It still reminds me more than it being pixel perfect, and these games always were designed to have like that blur in mind. You were never supposed to see it pristine and clear. The company M2 that worked on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection has been awesome, and like with converting everything, and I haven't seen any flaws. Usually where there's slowdown on the original sources, there's slowdown in this, which is fine, so they didn't fix any of that. Now if there was slowdown in inappropriate areas, I would probably have issue with that, but since there's slowdown in the parts where the actual game had slowdown, that actually makes it feel more authentic. Although I do wish they did fix the speed for the Castlevania Adventure, making it a way better game, because that game on the Game Boy is super slow. I'm talking all around this place because I covered this game so much, but I should just talk about some of my memories with this game, just because the videos that I recorded before probably weren't recorded with, I don't have the best stuff to record with, but they were recorded like probably fairly poorly compared to this, especially in the sound department. So Castlevania 3, again, like I said, was one of my favorite, not only NES games, but my favorite all-time Castlevania games. And at the time, I didn't get video game magazines. I actually went into, I believe it was either a Babbage's or Electronics boutique. I don't remember. I was fairly young. This was the early 90s. And I remember going in the store. My dad was actually really into the Commodore 64 still at this time, even though it was fairly late in the Commodore 64's lifestyle and we weren't terribly rich, so we were kind of behind the times a little bit when it comes to technology, even though he worked on the newest stuff at his work, but at home it was kind of a different story. So we got our NES. We probably only had it for like a year or so, and I played the first 2 Castlevanias. For some reason, even though I never could get really far in Castlevania 2, I really liked that one. I don't know, the soundtrack and the whole sense of discovery, even though I didn't really know how to play the game and I really didn't progress that far. That was really intriguing to me. Although when my dad still played video games before we accidentally erased all his progress on the Legend of Zelda, because I'm a kid and you know, like, kids have like short-term memories, and I didn't hold restart and it deleted his hours and hours of progress, and then he like swore off video games for basically forever. But with the first Castlevania, we almost had like a friendly competition, like where we would try to see who would get further. And at the time, my dad was actually better than I was at video games, and then as I played it more and more, I eventually got better and surpassed it. But anyway, we went to Electronics Boutique. This might actually been after he quit playing video games. When we went in there, like he was just really into Commodore 64 and making programs. And there was like this really primitive online bulletin board thing. Here I was a little bit worried that I was going to select the wrong thing because nothing's in English and I couldn't remember if yes or no was on top. But yeah, in this one obviously plays multiple characters, but like I said, I kind of covered all of this game in past video, all of this game in past video. Sorry, my English is kind of out there. I wasn't even planning on to make a video, but I'm like, I just better do it, you know, suck it up. So this is kind of interesting where you actually have to go back down. I'm sure I probably pointed out in the other video, but I'm pointing it out again, and I guess you'll just have to deal with it or just watch a different video. But anyway, so we were in Electronics Boutique, and I remember him showing me the Commodore 64 version of Castlevania, which I'm sure played horrible because on Commodore 64 games you had to push up to jump, and I don't even know how you would use your sub weapons in that game. It must have been weird, but as a kid, I don't know, in my mind I thought the Commodore 64 for whatever reason looked better. I always felt like the colors looked better than the NES. The NES always had like this really grainy look I can't really describe. It just looks grittier, where the Commodore 64, the pixels were big and chunky, but I felt like it was more colorful. I always felt like it did really impressive things. Like the NES felt like it could do more detail, I guess because the pixels were smaller, but I don't know. But I remember him showing me that, and then for whatever reason that made me think, what if there's a Castlevania 3? Because I remember going into the video store after playing Castlevania 1 and then eventually owning it. Like, I got it at a flea market, which is like basically a giant yard sale if you don't know what a flea market is. These things are becoming more and more rare as time goes on. Like, I watched some video like the other day. Somebody was talking about something that's like still like common where I live. They're like, remember those? I can't remember what it was, so it's pointless to even bring it up. I'm sure it'll pop in my head after I was done this video. But I just always remember going into the store, and I didn't have Video Game Magazine, so it would be like me going in the store and it's like, I wonder if they came out with part 2 yet. This was especially pretty common for Mega Man because they had 6 sequels. So every time I went into the store, I felt like there was like Mega Man 4, Mega Man 5, and then eventually Mega Man 6. I just always assumed that there would be a sequel. So for whatever reason, I'm like, I wonder if there's a Castlevania 3. I had no idea, and I looked at it, and it was just amazing. The artwork on the Castlevania covers have always been really amazing to me. The Konami had the pinnacle of artwork. I not too long ago watched some documentary on YouTube. I wish I remember like what it was called so I could post the link, but it's really cool. It was like somebody who did some of the artwork, especially for Konami, like in the 90s and possibly late 80s. and it was really cool, and it's like a lost art. The like most of the stuff that you see on video game covers now, if you see it hand drawn, it's usually some anime based game, but most games are like either horribly photoshopped or just made with CGI, and it's just not the same as like that hand painted feeling. Even though Bloodstained Ritual of the Night was a budget game and has kind of like an anime art style a little bit, I love the fact that they went back to the old school like hand painted cover art. That was so nice. It must have been a shock for the person that like gave it to me like at GameStop, because they're like, it looks really cool, the cover is really nice, because you don't really see like hand painted covers that much anymore, and it was really nice. So I like stared at it, like getting that game was like out of the question. Like I said, we didn't have a lot of money growing up. I wanted it for Christmas, never happened. I didn't get Castlevania 3 until at least 4 to 5 years afterwards. But one day I was thinking about it, and I just randomly had an idea popped up in my head, and I'm only like 7 or 8 years old like when I thought about this. In retrospective, but it's probably only like 3 years. It just felt like that long. Like it would be the equivalent of, I guess, what felt like 5 years now. I forget how like short, like how much of a short amount of time felt like such a long stretch of time when you're a little kid. So when I'm looking back, I'm looking at it through little kids' eyes versus adult eyes. I remember summer vacation feeling like forever. But anyway, for whatever reason, it was like a year or two later. I remember we were living in a different house. It was like our first house that we rented, because we were living in like apartments for a long time, and we were pretty broke, and it wasn't the best area, and people were starting to use drugs on the streets and stuff like that, like out in the public, like nobody even gave a shit. And I was a pretty mischievous child, so I used to take off and run or whatever. So my mother is like, we got to get out of here. So we moved from right outside the city to the suburbs, where I had some of my best childhood memories. It's a time in my life I'm like super nostalgic about, and I probably don't remember it exactly the way it was, because a lot of times I block out like all the negative stuff and just remember that time as being almost perfect. But anyway, I just remember, for whatever reason, the idea of Castlevania 3 randomly popped up in my head again. I wasn't obviously ever gonna get it for Christmas, I figured anyway, but Christmas felt like forever too, so maybe I just gave up after one Christmas, I don't know. But I was like, can we go to the video store and see if they have Castlevania 3? And for whatever reason, like I would usually have to like really nag like my mom to be able to rent something, or I'd do like the sad child thing and like pick up something and stare at it for a long time, like I was like little orphan Annie or little orphan Mikey. And like I was like just holding the box and like staring at it, which I tried at Electronics Boutique or Babbage's or wherever the store was with my dad, but my dad didn't really fall for stuff like that. It was usually my mom. But so she just said, yeah, we'll go and look. Maybe she thought that they wouldn't have it, but they did, and they had a free copy, and it blew my mind. And I picked it up, and this game was like everything I hoped for more. And what's funny is I was slightly disappointed that it wasn't like Castlevania 2 for whatever reason, but that was the best thing possible. And I was terrible at the game, and yeah, I remember like the graveyards and fighting the skeleton knight, and this is the coolest thing. For whatever reason, I was really getting into like Egypt and mummies and graveyards and stuff like that. I don't know. I was really obsessed with the dead, which is really weird at that time because I only had an uncle die when I was like 3, and I don't remember much about it because I wasn't part of like the wake or anything like that. So I never really had a lot of experience with dealing with death until my teens. My grandfather died, but again, we just kind of talked about it, but I didn't really have any real experience until my late 20s to early 30s, which sounds really weird, but that's the first time I've ever seen anybody dead or whatever. So it's kind of fresh actually, but I don't know, I guess sometimes you're more fascinated with the unknown. Also, I was a very easily afraid kid. Like, everything in movies scared me. Like, I would get scared from I would get terrified from the part on Raiders of the Lost Ark when Marion sees all those mummies and stuff like that. Sorry if I spoiled the movie for you. Oh well, get over it. But anyway, just anything with skeletons, mummies. I remember seeing Alien, that scared the shit out of me. Everything horror related scared the shit out of me, which was weird because I wasn't allowed to see these movies, and the few times that I saw them, they were heavily edited and put on TV. But I don't know, sometimes you get morbidly fascinated with like things that terrify you for whatever reason, or at least I did. And so like I was always drawn to horror themes and stuff like that, even though I wasn't allowed to watch them or anything like that. It's almost like when somebody tells you how bad a game is, or somebody tells me at least how bad a game is, I'm more like interested in playing the game. There's just always a morbid curiosity sometimes about, like, within reason, of course, like nothing like bad or like harmful, but like when it came to like horror movies or stuff like that, or things that people don't like, I'm always curious, why don't people like this? Or like I need to know for myself. And when I was a kid, even though I was afraid of something, I always wanted to, I guess maybe it was my way of conquering it, I don't know, but it just seemed like gothic horror themes seemed fascinating. Also around this time, I was really getting into the scary stories to tell in the dark. I know they're making a movie, but it looks like it's like its own thing, kind of like, I guess I haven't seen it, but it looks like it's taking like the same route as the Goosebump things, where the stories come alive in the real world instead of actually telling the stories, which I was hoping they were going to do like Tales of the Crypt. But I mean, some of those stories are only like 3 pages long. Like, how much are you going to do in a segment with a 3-page long story? But the artwork in that book was fascinating. And I remember like later on, we used to have like an annual book fair where the school would actually set up like all these books that you could purchase, and I always tried to get the scary stories to tell in the dark. I was able to get one time, and I just remember, like, I guess parents complained or whatever, and you had to get your parents' permission to be able to get them, because some of the stories had like ghosts and zombies in them, and it showed pictures of like ghouls and rotten flesh and body parts. It wasn't like grotesque, it was grotesque in a surreal way. But all this stuff in Castlevania 3 resonated with me, and it just always became one of my favorite games and the best Castlevania game on the NES. And I'm glad that my mom let me rent it that time, because it blew my mind. It was one of the best memories I ever had. Check out the Castlevania Anniversary Collection. It's well worth it, even though it's digital. I hope they eventually come out with a physical release, but, you know, wish in one hand, shit in the other. Thank you so much for watching. Sorry it was off topic, but if you watch my channel, you should be used to that by now. So that was Castlevania 3, probably for the 3rd time. Thank you so much, and take care. Have a nice day. Or night. I don't know what you're doing.
If you want to, Like, comment, and subscribe! Thanks for watching!